There's a man in Boston who controls 37 blocks of waterfront territory, who's ordered things done that would keep a federal prosecutor awake for a decade, and the only thing that's ever broken him was hearing his wife's heart monitor flatline 6 seconds after his daughter's first cry. He never told the little girl the truth. He told her your mother was a terrible woman who left us, because he couldn't bear his daughter growing up believing she was the reason her mother died, so he gave her a villain instead of a ghost. And that lie created a loneliness inside that child, so deep that one afternoon she slipped past 2 armed bodyguards, ran half a mile through an industrial district she'd never seen, and found a woman kneeling in the dirt near a scrapyard sorting copper wire with blackened hands and a dog the size of a small bear beside her. And this woman smiled at the little girl with a gentleness that didn't match a single thing about her circumstances. And the child reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill and said, "I have $100. Can I buy one day of you? I want you to be my mom." And the woman looked at that bill and looked at that child and laughed, not because it was funny, but because her heart broke and reassembled in the same second. And she said, "Put your money away. Today's free." And what nobody knew yet was that this woman sorting scrap metal in the dirt was the one person alive who could unlock the secrets that man's dead father left behind. Secrets that would expose who really betrayed the family from the inside. And she'd been hiding in plain sight, barely half a mile from his front door, for 7 years, and his 5-year-old daughter just found her with a $100 bill and a question about being a mom. If this story doesn't get you, I don't know what will. So hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now let's go back to the night Emerson Kane's wife died on that operating table and the lie he told his daughter that changed everything. 5 years earlier, Massachusetts General Hospital, the 4th floor, the maternity ward, 31-year-old Emerson Kane sat on the plastic chair outside the operating room hallway and looked down at his hands. The hands that had once strangled his first man when he was 19. The hands that had signed orders that made the entire Boston harbor tremble with fear. And now those hands were shaking because a woman, who weighed less than 110 pounds, was lying behind a steel door he wasn't allowed to walk through. The doctors had told them from the 6th month. They had placed numbers and risk percentages in front of Colette, and had used the phrase, "continuing is not recommended," in the voice of someone who had said that sentence too many times. And Emerson had looked at his wife and said, "You don't have to do this." And Colette had looked back at him with the eyes he had loved from the very first time he saw them at the free clinic on Congress Street. And she had said that she wouldn't give up the baby, that she had already chosen, that this was their child, and she wouldn't let numbers decide for her. Emerson had known right then that he wouldn't win this argument, because Colette was the only person in the world he couldn't order around, didn't want to order around, and that helplessness was both the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. He sat in the hallway and listened, not because he wanted to listen, but because his body wouldn't let him do anything else except sit there and listen. And the first sound he recognized was a cry, small and shrill and angry in the way newborns are angry when they're pulled from the only place they have ever known. And Emerson stood up, because that cry meant his daughter had arrived, and in that moment, he almost smiled. Then he heard footsteps, quick, urgent, shoes striking tile as they rushed toward the operating room, and calls for assistance in terms he didn't understand but didn't need to understand, because the pace of those footsteps had already said everything. The doctor came out after 17 minutes, minutes Emerson counted second by second, and the man didn't need to say anything, because the way he looked at Emerson, the way he pulled off his gloves, and then put them back on, and then pulled them off again, the way he opened his mouth and stopped and opened it again, all those gestures were already the answer before the answer was spoken aloud. They brought Blythe out to him, wrapped in a white hospital blanket, so tiny he was afraid he would break her if he held her too tightly, and she had black hair, black like Colette's. And when Emerson looked down at that wrinkled, red little face, he understood that his wife had been right. She had chosen this baby instead of choosing herself, and the baby had arrived, and Colette had not. Emerson Kane stood in the middle of the hospital hallway holding his newborn daughter, and didn't cry, not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him had frozen solid the very moment the doctor removed his gloves for the second time. Something had been locked away by the same kind of mechanism he had used to survive in the underworld for the past 20 years, and that thing would need another 5 years before it began to thaw. He brought Blythe back to the Beacon Hill mansion that night. He went straight to the bedroom that had belonged to him and Colette, locked the door from the outside, put the key into the drawer of his desk, and walked down the hallway, taking every photograph of Colette off the walls, one by one, 14 photographs in all, and he laid them all face down in the filing cabinet in the basement. Not because he hated her, but because every photograph was proof that she had been here and now was not, and he couldn't look at that proof every day and still keep the thing that was holding him upright. That night, he sat in the darkness of the nursery, in the rocking chair Colette had chosen in the 4th month, and watched Blythe sleep in her crib, and he made the decision he would pay for throughout the next 5 years. The girl would never know her mother had died because of her. The girl would never grow up with the thought that her own existence was the reason her mother no longer existed. He would give her another story, a story in which the blame belonged to the one who had left, not to the one who had remained. Your mother was a bad person. Your mother abandoned us. Emerson knew that lie was wrong. He also knew that the truth, the specific truth that your mother died so you could live, would be a burden no child should have to carry. And between 2 terrible choices, he chose the one he believed would destroy his daughter less. He was wrong, but it would take him another 5 years to know that. 5 years after that night, the Beacon Hill mansion looked from the outside like a place any child would dream of growing up in. 3 stories of gray stone, wrought iron gates, a marble-paved entrance, an eastern garden trimmed every week by a gardener Blythe had never seen because he came at 6 o'clock in the morning and left before she woke. 5-year-old Blythe Kane had 2 rotating bodyguards named Neil and Briggs, had an armored Cadillac Escalade taking her to and from the private school on Beacon Hill every morning, had a GPS watch on her wrist that she thought was an ordinary watch because no one had told her that every step she took appeared on Gordon Walsh's phone screen, and had a nanny named Ruth, 55 years old, who had worked for the Kane family for 20 years, and was the only person in the mansion who knew how to cook oatmeal in exactly the way Blythe would eat it. The mansion had 14 rooms, and Blythe used exactly 3, her bedroom, her playroom, and the kitchen, where she ate breakfast with Ruth every day at a table with enough seats for 12 people, though there were never more than 2 people sitting there. Emerson worked 14 hours a day, left the mansion before Blythe woke, and came home after she had gone to bed. And on the rare days when he came home early, he would stand in the doorway of Blythe's room and watch his daughter sleep, then go downstairs to the kitchen and ask Ruth, "Is she all right?" And Ruth would say, "She's all right." And Emerson would nod, then go into his study and close the door, and that was the entirety of his presence in his daughter's day. 2 words carried through someone else's mouth. Blythe didn't resent her father, because resentment required an expectation that had been betrayed, and she had never had any expectation to betray. She only knew that her father was a tall man with gray eyes whom she saw at Sunday breakfast, and sometimes didn't see for the whole of Sunday, and that was how everything worked, in the way children accept everything around them as normal, because they haven't yet had anything to compare it to. But there was one thing Blythe couldn't accept, and that thing wasn't her father's absence but her mother's absence, because her father at least still existed somewhere in the mansion, still had the smell of cologne on the coat hanging in the hallway closet, still had a voice that echoed through the study door at midnight when he was on the phone, but her mother had nothing, not one photograph on the wall, not one object in the house, not one person mentioning her, as though that woman had never existed at all. Last week, her teacher had assigned a family drawing. Blythe drew 3 people, her father standing on the left, tall, gray-eyed, stern-faced, herself standing in the middle, small, black-haired, and on the right was a 3rd figure, with no face, no details, only an outline wrapped around an empty space that Blythe had filled completely with yellow. The teacher looked at the drawing and asked who the 3rd person was, and Blythe said it was her mommy, that she didn't know her mommy's face, so she colored her like sunshine because she thought her mommy was warm like that. The teacher didn't say anything more. Ruth received the drawing when she picked Blythe up, looked at that yellow space, and that evening, when Emerson came home, she told him about it, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she thought he needed to know that his daughter was drawing a ghost in the color of sunlight because she had nothing else to draw. Emerson listened until Ruth had finished. He stayed silent for a very long time, the kind of silence Ruth had grown used to after 20 years but had never found comfortable, and then he said not to bring this up again. and he went into his study and closed the door, and Ruth stood in the hallway and understood that she had touched exactly the thing Emerson Kane didn't allow anyone to touch, not even himself. That night, Ruth read Blythe a bedtime story, the book with the bear and the mother bear going to the market, and when Ruth closed the book, Blythe lay still for a while, then asked, her voice small but clear in every word, the way children ask the questions they have thought about for a very long time before speaking them aloud. "Miss Ruth, do all mothers leave?" Ruth looked at the little girl and felt something catch inside her chest, because that question wasn't the question of a 5-year-old child. It was the question of someone who had lived long enough inside an emptiness to begin thinking that emptiness was the default. Ruth opened her mouth, but she couldn't find any words that were both true and wouldn't break the promise she had kept to Emerson for 5 years. Blythe didn't wait for an answer. She said, in the calm way only children can be calm when saying something heartbreaking, "I don't think so. I think it's just my mommy." Then she turned her face to the wall, pulled the blanket up, and said nothing more. And Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, looking at that small back, and understood that the lie Emerson had built to protect his daughter was eating away at the girl from the side he couldn't see. While Blythe lay with her face turned toward the wall inside the Beacon Hill mansion, barely a half-mile trek across the industrial bridge, on the outskirts of Everett, in a 1-story wooden house at the end of a dirt road near an industrial scrapyard yard, a 28-year-old woman named Sable Thornton was sitting on the floor sorting copper wire beneath the light of the only bulb that still worked, and the Neapolitan Mastiff named Goliath lay pressed against her legs, weighing 132 pounds and looking like a monster, yet resting his head on her lap with the obedience of an animal that understood this woman was its entire world. 9 years earlier, Sable Thornton had been 19 years old and had not been a scrap picker. She was what the cybersecurity world called a self-taught prodigy, the kind of person who dropped out of college halfway through, not because she couldn't study, but because college had nothing left to teach her. She had written her first encryption algorithm herself at 16 in the bedroom of a rented apartment in Somerville, had broken through the security system of a financial company at 17, just to prove that it could be broken, had been invited by MIT into a research program at 18, and had left after 1 semester because she realized that what they were teaching was something she had already known 2 years earlier. Hutton Kane found her through an intermediary in the underground technology world, and he came to meet her at a cafe in Cambridge with an offer she couldn't refuse, not because of the money, but because of the challenge. To build a perfect encryption system, something no one on Earth except the person who created it could decode, to protect every secret of the Kane family. Sable looked at the silver-haired man in gold-rimmed glasses sitting across from her and understood at once that he wasn't an ordinary businessman, that the secrets he spoke of were not ordinary business secrets. But she was 19, and 19 is the age when intelligence runs faster than wisdom, and she said yes. She worked for Hutton for 14 months. He arranged a private office for her, 3 monitors, access to every financial system of the family, and the kind of respect he rarely gave to anyone under 40. She finished building the encryption system, installed it onto a separate hard drive that Hutton kept in his personal safe, and she was the only person besides Hutton who knew how to decode it. Then, Hutton died. 8 years earlier, under circumstances the Boston police concluded were a heart attack, though no one in the underworld truly believed that, and Sable realized that the only man who knew she existed and had a reason to keep her safe was gone. She left right after the funeral, returned to ordinary life, to her small apartment in Dorchester, and tried to forget that she had once sat at the heart of an underground empire and seen every number inside it. 1 year later, 7 years earlier, on a March night when the temperature in Boston fell below freezing, Sable's apartment caught fire at 3 o'clock in the morning. She woke because of Goliath, who was only a 4-month-old puppy then, biting her sleeve and pulling with milk teeth whose strength wasn't enough to move her but was enough to wake her, and when she opened her eyes, smoke had already filled half the room, and the window was the only way out. She held Goliath and jumped from the 2nd floor to the 1st floor porch roof, then down to the ground, and stood watching the apartment burn, and she understood, with the cold precision of someone who had spent 14 months reading every secret inside the Kane family, that this was not an accident, accelerant, Someone inside the family knew she knew too much and had decided that making her disappear forever was the safest option. Sable didn't call the police. She didn't call anyone. She carried Goliath into the dark. And over the next 48 hours, she erased every trace of Sable Thornton from the world, canceled her SIM card, closed her bank accounts, ended her lease, deleted every online record she could delete. And with the skill of someone who had built a security system for a billionaire family, she knew how to erase herself more completely than anyone. She became no one. 7 years of picking scrap. 7 years of selling copper, aluminum, and old steel to scrap yards in Everett and Chelsea, paid in cash, no names asked, no papers needed. 7 years of living in the wooden house she had found abandoned near the industrial dump and repaired by hand, plank by plank, nail by nail. From the outside, the house looked shabby enough that no one would want to step inside, but inside it was different. Clean curtains sewn from old fabric, a basil plant on the windowsill, books neatly arranged on shelves she had built herself, floors swept every morning. It wasn't the home of someone who had given up. It was the home of someone who had chosen to live with as little as possible so no one could find her, yet had still kept inside herself the thing that 7 years of running couldn't take away: precision, cleanliness, the refusal to become what circumstances wanted to turn her into. And Goliath, the 4-month-old puppy who had bitten her sleeve on the night of the fire, was now over 7 years old, 132 pounds, his face full of wrinkles and looking like something that had stepped out of a nightmare, but lying down the moment Sable placed her hand on his head. That dog was her security system, her family, the only proof that Sable Thornton still existed and still had something in this world that belonged to her. Until the afternoon, a 5-year-old girl with gray eyes and black hair appeared by the fence and changed everything. Blythe came back the next day with the second $100 bill, and the day after that with the third, and so on, every afternoon after school repeating exactly the same route she had discovered the first time. Climbing through the ground-floor bathroom window during the roughly 4 minutes when Neil and Briggs changed shifts, and no one had ever really checked the bathroom, running along the eastern fence past the empty lot, crossing the small road that led out toward the old industrial district of Everett, and arriving at the wooden house where Goliath had begun to recognize her scent from far away and no longer barked, but simply stood up and wagged his tail. On the second day, Sable taught Blythe how to sort scrap: copper on one side, aluminum on one side, steel on one side, and Blythe squatted among the piles of metal as seriously as if she were taking a test at school, picking up each piece and asking what this was, and Sable said copper, and Blythe asked how she knew, and Sable said because the color was different when she scraped away the layer of dust on the outside, and she scraped it to show Blythe, and Blythe watched the copper shine beneath the dirt with wide eyes, as though she had just been shown magic. On the third day, Sable cooked instant noodles on the old gas stove, and Blythe ate 2 bowls because she had never eaten instant noodles in her life. In the mansion, there was a private chef who cooked dishes Blythe never remembered the names of, but the bowl of instant noodles in the wooden house, with Goliath lying at her feet and Sable sitting across from her, she remembered, and she would remember it forever. On the 4th day, Sable braided Blythe's hair, 2 long braids down her back, and while she braided, she told the little girl about the stars, not fairy tales about princesses in the sky, but real science, that even the light from the nearest star took more than 4 years to reach Earth, that there were stars that had died millions of years earlier, but their light was still traveling toward us, that when you looked up at the night sky you were looking into the past. And Blythe listened with the focused silence only children have when they feel they're being spoken to like grown-ups, instead of being talked down to like children. Then she asked, "So if my mommy left 4 years ago, is her light still coming to me?" And Sable stopped halfway through the braid and didn't answer right away, because she didn't know the story about Blythe's mother and she didn't want to say anything wrong. So she only said that light always keeps traveling, it never stops. And Blythe said, "Then I guess my mommy is still coming." On the 5th day, the 6th day, Blythe began calling Sable Miss S, because the little girl said the name Sable was too hard, and Sable accepted that shortened name with a small smile, and every afternoon when the little girl came, she would hear feet running on the dirt road and the call, Miss S, and Goliath would stand up before Sable even had time to react. On the 7th day, Blythe was sitting and watching Sable sort electrical wire, and the little girl said it naturally, without warning, without hesitation, in an ordinary voice as if she were naming an obvious truth. "Mommy S. Get me the bottle of water." Sable's hand stopped. She looked at the little girl. She heard the word mommy clearly inside the small house, and she felt that word touch some place inside her that 7 years of living alone had made her forget still existed. She didn't correct her. She got the bottle of water, wrapped a cloth around the cap the way she had the first time, handed it to Blythe, and the little girl drank without knowing that she had just given the woman picking scrap in front of her something no amount of money could buy. At home, Ruth noticed the change first. Blythe began singing in the bathroom, songs Ruth didn't recognize, not songs from school, maybe songs someone had sung to her. Blythe smiled at Ruth more often, truly smiled, not the polite smile she had learned far too early in this mansion. Blythe finished her dinner every night, instead of nibbling a few bites and pushing the plate away as she usually did. Ruth noticed all those changes, and she wanted to ask, wanted to know what had happened, but she looked at Blythe singing and decided not to ask, because this was the first time in 5 years she had seen the little girl look like an ordinary 5-year-old child, instead of a 5-year-old child trying to survive inside a house too large, too empty, too silent. And Ruth didn't want to break whatever was making that happen. She didn't know about the $100 bill. She didn't know about the bathroom window. She didn't know about the wooden house or Sable or Goliath. She only knew that Blythe was happy, and that happiness was coming from somewhere outside this mansion, and she chose not to ask. But Emerson's desk drawer didn't get to choose anything. 10 $100 bills. 10 days. $1,000 gone from the drawer of the man who controlled 37 districts of Boston Harbor. And though $1,000 to Emerson Kane mattered no more than a penny fallen under a chair, its disappearance mattered in an entirely different way, because in his world nothing disappeared without a reason, and whatever reason explained why 10 bills were missing from his desk drawer was a reason he needed to know. Emerson opened the drawer of his desk on Thursday night, after ending a call with the man in charge of the Southern Harbor, and he counted, not because he was suspicious, but because he counted everything. That was how he had survived 20 years in a world where precision was the thing that separated the living from the dead, and the amount missing was exactly $1,000, 10 $100 bills. Emerson didn't think of theft, because no one in this mansion would dare steal from him, not because they were loyal, but because they knew the consequences. And the list of people allowed into his study had only 2 names on it: Gordon Walsh and Blythe. His daughter came into his room every Sunday morning to place her newest drawing on his desk. It was the only ritual between father and daughter that neither of them ever spoke aloud. And the drawer of his desk wasn't locked, because he had never thought there was any need to lock anything in front of a 5-year-old child. He called Gordon. Gordon came to the study within 4 minutes, closed the door behind him, and Emerson asked whether the girl had been going anywhere after school, and Gordon stayed silent for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of silence Emerson had learned to read after 12 years of working together, the kind of silence that meant, "I know the answer, and the answer is more complicated than you think." Gordon said he had known since the 3rd day. He said he had discovered Blythe slipping out through the ground floor bathroom window during the exact 4-minute gap between Neil and Briggs's shifts, that she ran along the eastern fence, through the empty lot, down the dirt road behind the old industrial district, to a 1-story wooden house near the scrapyard in Everett, and that he had followed her for 3 consecutive days before deciding not to intervene immediately. Emerson looked at Gordon with a stare that anyone else in the family would have understood as a sign that they should start worrying about their own safety, but Gordon wasn't anyone else. Gordon said the reason he hadn't reported it immediately was that he had observed the woman at that house from a distance, through binoculars, for 3 consecutive afternoons, and he had seen no signs of danger, no visible weapons, no strangers coming in and out, no suspicious communication devices, only a thin woman picking scrap, and a dog as big as a calf lying beside her, and that dog protected Blythe better than most bodyguards Gordon had ever trained. It lay between the little girl and the door every time there was an unfamiliar sound. It followed her when she went to the bathroom behind the house and stood waiting outside the door. It did all those things by instinct, not training, and that told Gordon more about the woman who had raised it than any background file could. But there was something that made Gordon uneasy. and that was the second reason he hadn't reported it right away. He had taken a photograph of the woman from a distance with a lens and run it through facial recognition. No results. Not in the federal DMV system, not in the NCIC database, not in any system Gordon had access to, legal or otherwise. No driver's license, no tax records, no bank account, no social security number matching that face. This woman, digitally speaking, didn't exist. Gordon said that in 20 years of security work, 10 years in the military and 10 years for the Kane family, he had only met two kinds of people who didn't exist in the system, victims or specialists. And this woman didn't look like a victim. Emerson asked, "Then, what is she?" Gordon took out his laptop, opened a database he didn't usually use, the Kane family's internal database from Hutton's time. The old system Emerson knew existed, but rarely accessed, because most of the data inside it belonged to his father's era, and he had left it alone the way he had left Colette's room alone, not because it didn't matter, but because opening it meant having to face it. Gordon typed in a search code, and the screen flickered with a single line, then vanished immediately afterward, as though even the system itself didn't want it to be seen. S. Thornton, consultant, cleared by Hutton Kane. Gordon closed the laptop. He looked at Emerson and said he didn't know yet who S. Thornton was, didn't know why this file existed in Hutton's database, didn't know what she had done for Emerson's father, or why she had disappeared from every system afterward, and he needed more time to investigate before drawing any conclusion, because this was a file confirmed by Hutton Kane himself, and anything Hutton had touched was more complicated than its surface. He said all of that, but the sentence he chose to end the report with was the simplest one. She has nothing in the system, so either she's no one, or she's very good at becoming no one. Emerson heard that sentence and fell silent. Not the long silence Gordon measured as dangerous, but the short, sharp silence of a man who had already made his decision before anyone else could say more. Emerson said 4 words. "Take me there, then 2 more, tonight." At 9 o'clock that night, Emerson and Gordon stopped the car 50 meters from the wooden house on the dirt road, with no streetlights, no other bodyguards, no escort vehicles, because Emerson wanted to see it with his own eyes before deciding how much force was needed, and he had learned very early in this line of work that arriving somewhere with an army meant he had already decided before looking, while arriving alone meant he was still assessing. Gordon walked 3 steps behind him, his right hand resting at his hip out of habit, not because he thought he would need to draw anything, but because 10 years in the military had trained his body to do it automatically whenever he entered an uncontrolled space. Goliath barked before they came within 15 steps of the door, a deep, thick bark, rumbling from the chest of the 132-pound dog, not the bark of a house dog, but the bark of something more primal, a warning that said, "I know you're there, and I'm deciding what you are." The light inside the house came on. Soft footsteps moved across the wooden floor. The door opened. Sable stood in the doorway, her left hand resting on Goliath's head, and looked out into the darkness ahead. She saw the tall man, the black coat, the gray eyes in the light spilling from inside, and she recognized those eyes immediately, not because she knew who this man was, but because those eyes were exactly like the eyes that had looked at her every afternoon for the past 10 days, Blythe's gray eyes, and that resemblance needed no explanation beyond a single word: father. Sable had cut every tie with the old world for 7 years. She didn't read news about the Kane family, didn't look into who was running it, didn't know whether Hutton had a son or what that son's name was or what he looked like. She had deliberately chosen not to know, because knowing was dangerous, but she didn't need to know anything about the man in front of her beyond those eyes to understand that he was the father of the little girl who had bought her with a $100 bill each day, and that little girl had told her enough for Sable to understand that her father was powerful, had bodyguards, had a mansion, and that no one dared go against him. Emerson looked at her and saw exactly what Gordon had described, yet something completely different from what he had imagined. Thin, faded jeans, an old shirt that was clean but had yellowed with age, standing inside a cramped wooden house with a dog as big as a calf, and nothing about her, not a single thing, suggested she was a threat in any of the ways Emerson had prepared to handle. He had prepared for the possibility that she was using his daughter to gain access to the family, He had prepared for the possibility that she was a spy planted by the Voss family or by any organization that wanted to find his weakness. He had prepared for the possibility that she was an abductor building trust before making a move. He had not prepared for those eyes. Eyes that looked at him without fear, something nearly everyone he met for the first time had, no matter how well they hid it. Not defiance, the thing foolish or reckless people usually showed when facing someone stronger than themselves. Those eyes were only assessing him, calm and precise, the way someone looked at a problem before deciding whether it was worth solving. And Emerson realized she wasn't afraid of him, not because she didn't know he was dangerous, but because she had lived long enough with something more frightening than him. He asked, his voice low, controlled, "What have you been doing with my daughter?" Sable looked at him for another second, as though weighing how much she should say, then answered in a voice that was neither apologetic nor defensive. "She bought my time. $100 a day. She hired me to be her mother." Emerson fell silent. Not the short, sharp silence from when he had ordered Gordon to take him there tonight. Not the long, dangerous silence Gordon measured. This was a third kind of silence, the kind Gordon had never seen in 12 years, the silence of a man who had just been struck in a place his armor didn't cover, and that sentence struck home not because it contained a threat, but because it contained the truth. His daughter was so lonely she was paying money to have a mother, and that loneliness had been caused by no one but him. Emerson said Sable had to stay away from his daughter. He said it in the voice he used when giving final instructions in a conference room, the voice that allowed no argument, the voice everyone in the 37 districts of Boston Harbor understood as a line that couldn't be crossed. Sable heard that sentence and neither nodded nor shook her head. She said, her voice soft but every word clear, as if she had thought about them for a very long time before speaking them aloud. "You can stop her from coming here. You can't stop her from needing to come here. Those are two different things." Emerson looked at her. In his world, no one spoke to him that way. No one dared. And what kept him from reacting at once wasn't her courage, because he had met all kinds of courageous people and most of them were courageous because they were stupid. It was her precision. She was right, and Emerson Kane was the kind of man who hated many things, but hated nothing more than someone being right about the thing he had gotten wrong. He turned and walked away. No threat, no further warning, no looking back. Gordon followed, and in the car on the way home, Gordon didn't ask anything, because he knew Emerson's silence right now wasn't the kind that needed to be broken. Sable stood in the doorway watching the taillights disappear into the darkness, and she placed her hand on Goliath's head, and she understood that the man who had just left without making a threat was more dangerous than anyone she had ever met, because people who threatened were reacting while this man was processing, and people who processed instead of reacted were the kind who should never be underestimated. The next morning, Emerson called Gordon at 6 o'clock and gave 3 instructions. 1. Lock the ground floor bathroom window. 2. Add a 3rd bodyguard to the afternoon shift to erase the 4-minute gap between Neil and Briggs's rotation. 3. Install more cameras in the eastern hallway and the empty lot leading out of the mansion. Emerson Kane solved problems the way he had solved every problem for the past 20 years. Control it, lock it down, guard it, eliminate the variable. But this time, the variable was his daughter, and his daughter was not a harbor district or a business rival or a disloyal member of the family. His daughter was a 5-year-old child, with gray eyes like his and stubbornness like his. And when Blythe came down to breakfast that morning and saw the bathroom window locked, she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't pound on the door. She only looked at the new lock for a long while, then returned to the dining table, sat down in front of the oatmeal Ruth had cooked exactly the way she liked it, and didn't touch it. Ruth thought the little girl was sulking, the ordinary kind of sulking a 5-year-old does, the kind that would be forgotten by lunch. Blythe didn't eat lunch. She sat in front of the sandwich Ruth had cut into star shapes as always and didn't touch it. She didn't speak either, not one word, didn't answer when Ruth asked if she wanted milk, didn't react when Neil tried to joke with her in the hallway, didn't open her mouth all day. That evening, Ruth placed a plate of food in front of Blythe, and Blythe sat looking at it with the patient silence of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the world around her to catch up. And Ruth watched the food slowly grow cold on the table and began to understand that this wasn't sulking. On the second day, Blythe still didn't eat. No oatmeal, no sandwich, no milk, no juice, nothing Ruth placed in front of her. She sat at the dining table on time, put her hands on the table, looked at the plate of food, and didn't touch it. She went to school as usual, sat in class as usual, but her lunchbox came back untouched. Ruth called Emerson at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the second day in a voice that, in 20 years of working for the Kane family, she had never used with the boss. A voice that wasn't reporting so much as almost pleading. She said Blythe hadn't eaten anything for 2 days. She said the little girl hadn't spoken a single word. She said she had tried everything. Instant noodles, ice cream, cake, pizza, all the things children couldn't refuse, and Blythe had refused them all. Emerson arrived at the mansion within 40 minutes, the fastest he had ever come home in 5 years, and he went straight into the kitchen, where Blythe was sitting in front of the afternoon plate Ruth had just set down. He sat across from his daughter. The two of them looked at each other across the 12-seat table that had never held more than 2 people, and Emerson saw on Blythe's face the thing he saw every morning in the mirror. Gray eyes that wouldn't yield, a lightly clenched jaw, a silence that wasn't there because she had nothing to say, but because she had chosen not to speak until speaking would create the greatest effect. He was looking at himself made small, and that realization filled him with pride in the way any father feels proud when he sees himself in his child, while also frightening him, because he knew better than anyone how far that stubbornness could go. Blythe opened her mouth, and the first sentence she spoke after 2 days of silence wasn't a plea or a cry, but a declaration, clear, each word placed exactly where it belonged, as if she had practiced them in her head for the past 48 hours. "I want to see Miss Sable. If you don't let me, I won't eat." Emerson looked at his 5-year-old daughter sitting before a plate of cold food, and he realized that she was using the very tactic he had used in every important negotiation of his life: firmness, silence, the willingness to endure damage in order to hold a position, not attacking, only refusing to yield until the other side understood that the cost of forcing her to give in was higher than the cost of giving her what she wanted. He had taught that tactic to his people. He had used it to build an empire, and now his 5-year-old daughter was using it on him, not because anyone had taught her, but because it ran in her blood. And in that moment Emerson understood that he could win every war in the world except this one, because forcing his daughter to eat by force would make him no different from the people he despised, and letting her starve would make him not a father, but a jailer. He looked at Blythe. Blythe looked at him. And he yielded, not completely, because Emerson Kane never yielded completely, but enough. Miss Sable would be allowed to see her, but here, in this house, under supervision, and if he saw anything he couldn't accept, this would stop immediately. Blythe looked at him for another 3 seconds, assessing whether that condition was real, then pulled the plate of food toward herself and began to eat. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway watching the scene, and she didn't know whether to feel relieved or worried, because she had just witnessed a 5-year-old child win a negotiation against the man no one in Boston dared say no to. Emerson stood, walked into the hallway, called Gordon, and said only one sentence: "Go get her." Gordon picked Sable up the next morning. He drove to the wooden house alone, knocked on the door, and when Sable opened it, he said briefly that Emerson Kane was inviting her to the mansion to see Blythe, with conditions, under supervision, and that she had the right to refuse. Sable looked at Gordon and asked what would happen if she refused. Gordon said the little girl would keep refusing to eat. Sable asked nothing more. She went inside to change, and her choice of clothes said more than any answer could have. An old white shirt, yellowed by time, faded jeans, canvas shoes, no makeup, her hair tied back in a ponytail with an elastic band. She wasn't trying to look better, and she wasn't trying to look worse. She was simply dressed as exactly what she was, and when she got into Gordon's car with Goliath left lying inside the house, watching her through the window with eyes that understood she was going into danger, it was the first time in 7 years that Sable had gone anywhere without him beside her. The car stopped in front of the Beacon Hill mansion, and Sable stepped out and looked up at the wrought iron gate, and she saw the name carved into the crossbar above it, Kane, in cast iron letters darkened by time but not blurred, and she stood still for 3 seconds, staring at that name, because it was the name she had been running from for 7 years, the name tied to the night her apartment burned, and the smell of smoke in her hair, and the sound of puppy Goliath biting her sleeve in the dark. and now she was standing before the gate of its house. She understood exactly where she was walking into. She understood that the family bearing this name had almost killed her once, and she was voluntarily stepping into its territory a second time. She still stepped inside, because of Blythe. She passed through the gate, walked along the stone-paved entrance. Through the front door Gordon opened for her, and stood in the mansion foyer with marble beneath her feet and a crystal chandelier above her head, and she didn't look impressed. Not because she was pretending, but because she had already seen behind this world. She had sat in the private office Hutton Kane had arranged for her, and had seen every number inside this empire, and the glitter of marble didn't impress someone who knew what lay beneath it. Blythe appeared at the top of the staircase. She stood there for 1 second, 2 seconds, as if she needed to be sure this was real and not the kind of dream she had dreamed many times during the 2 nights she hadn't eaten. Then she ran down, barefoot on the marble, so fast that Ruth behind her didn't have time to call out for her to be careful, and she threw herself at Sable, wrapping her arms around Sable's waist, and cried. Not crying from sadness or pain, but from relief, the kind of crying of a child who had been afraid that the thing she had just found would be taken away. And now it was here, right here, in the foyer of her own house, and maybe this time it would be allowed to stay. Sable knelt down and held Blythe back, and the little girl buried her face in Sable's shoulder, and Sable placed her hand on the girl's black hair and stayed still, saying nothing, because there were moments when saying anything at all was too much. Emerson stood on the staircase looking down. He saw his daughter holding a strange woman in a way Blythe had never held him, with complete surrender, with the trust only children can give when they decide someone is safe, and he saw on Blythe's face an expression he had never once been able to create for her in 5 years of being her father, an expression he didn't have the exact word for, but if he were forced to choose, the closest word would be peace. He stood on the staircase, and what cut into him wasn't jealousy, because he wasn't jealous of a woman who picked scrap. It was the recognition that his daughter had found in a stranger something he, with all his money, power, mansion, and bodyguards, had not been able to give her, and that recognition cut deeper than any knife. Over the following days, Sable came to the mansion every afternoon, at 3 o'clock, on time, in Gordon's car, and stayed for 3 hours before being taken home. She taught Blythe to paint in the playroom, not the kind of drawing they did at school, but painting with fingers on large sheets of paper spread across the floor, messy but happy, and Ruth had to clean the floor every evening, but she didn't complain because she heard Blythe laughing as she painted, and that laughter was worth more than a clean floor. Sable continued telling stories about the stars, one lesson every afternoon, and Blythe began to know the names of constellations before she even knew the entire alphabet. Sable braided Blythe's hair every afternoon before leaving, 2 braids down the back, exactly like the first time at the wooden house, and Blythe kept those 2 braids until the next morning, even though Ruth told her she had to undo them when she slept. 1 week later, Blythe drew a new family picture. Still 3 people, but this time, the third person wasn't a faceless yellow shadow. This time, the third person had a face, had hair tied in a ponytail, had eyes Blythe colored dark brown, had a smile, and beside the third person was a large black circle that Blythe explained was Goliath. She gave the drawing to Emerson on Sunday morning, placed it on his desk according to the ritual between father and daughter, and Emerson looked at the picture and asked, his voice normal though his chest wasn't normal. "Who is Miss Sable in your picture?" Blythe said, in the simplest voice in the world, "Mommy." Emerson held the drawing. He said nothing to Blythe except thank you. Then the little girl ran off, and he remained sitting in the study, holding the picture and looking at the face his daughter had drawn for the woman who picked scrap. A face with eyes, with a mouth, with a smile. The face that 5 years earlier had only been an empty space colored with sunshine, and he closed the study door and sat in the dark and didn't come out until afternoon. Emerson didn't trust strangers. That wasn't a personality trait but a condition of survival, and even though he had allowed Sable into the mansion because of Blythe, he never stopped watching, every afternoon, from the study with the glass door overlooking the playroom, or from the second-floor hallway where he stood far enough not to be seen but close enough to hear. And he began to notice things that didn't fit. On the 3rd afternoon after Sable came to the mansion, Blythe forgot the password to her iPad and handed it to Sable, asking her to open it, and Sable picked up the iPad, looked at the screen for 3 seconds, typed something Emerson couldn't see clearly from the hallway, and the iPad opened in less than 30 seconds, and she handed it back to Blythe with a casual gesture, as though she had just opened the cap of a water bottle instead of bypassing the security system his IT team had installed. Emerson watched the scene and said nothing, but he remembered it, because 30 seconds to crack an iPad wasn't the skill of someone who picked scrap. On the 5th afternoon, he heard Sable explain to Blythe why the moon didn't fall down to Earth, and she used a glass of water and an orange on the table to illustrate orbit in language that a 5-year-old child could completely understand. Scientifically accurate, but simple enough that Blythe nodded and said, "Oh, so it just keeps going around and around forever, Mommy S?" And Sable said yes, and Emerson stood in the hallway thinking that such an explanation required two things at once that people rarely had: deep understanding and the ability to turn that understanding into something someone without any foundation could grasp, and that combination didn't belong to someone who had learned by reading popular science books. It belonged to someone who had lived inside knowledge long enough to know how to step outside it. But the detail that truly made Emerson stop was on the 7th afternoon, when Sable led Blythe from the playroom to the kitchen to get water, and along the way she passed the security camera in the corner of the hallway, and she looked up at it, only for 1/10 of a second, then looked toward the second camera at the opposite end of the hallway. Then her eyes swept to the space between the two corners where there was no camera, and that was the way someone looked when assessing coverage and blind spots. Not the way someone looked out of curiosity or fear, but the way someone looked when they understood systems because they had once built systems. Emerson began asking Sable questions. Not an interrogation, not directly, but short conversations at the end of each afternoon after Blythe went upstairs with Ruth, small questions that looked like courtesy on the surface, but were probing underneath. How long had she lived in Everett? Did she have family? What had she done before picking scrap? Sable answered enough not to be rude, and not enough to reveal anything, saying she had been in Everett for a long time. She had no family, she had done many things, and every answer was technically true and completely useless as information. And Emerson realized that she avoided the past, not because she didn't remember it, but because she remembered it too clearly, and had decided that the past wasn't allowed to exist in any conversation. He also realized that she never asked him about Colette, never asked why Blythe had no mother, never touched that wound even though she was certainly curious, and that restraint told him she understood wounds because she had wounds of her own, and the two of them avoided each other's places of pain by instinct, like two animals moving through the same forest, without stepping into each other's traps, because both of them knew what traps looked like. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in the private office on the 32nd floor of the Boston Financial Center tower that the Kane family owned through 3 layers of shell companies, 58-year-old Perry Kane sat behind his desk and felt something changing that he couldn't control. Emerson had been colder in the last 3 meetings, not cold in an angry way, but cold in the manner of distance, the kind where Emerson didn't ask Perry's opinion on the Southern Harbor deal, though Perry would always have been consulted before, the kind where Emerson made decisions about territory allocation for the teams in Southie without informing Perry until after the decision had already been carried out, the kind where, when Perry called, Emerson picked up but ended the call 2 minutes sooner than usual. Perry had lived 30 years in the underworld, and those 30 years had taught him to read the language of power more accurately than any other language, and the language of power was telling him that he was being isolated, slowly, methodically, and he didn't yet know why. He didn't know about Sable. He didn't know about the old database Gordon had accessed. He didn't know that the name he had tried to erase 7 years earlier was sitting in the Kane Mansion playroom every afternoon, braiding his granddaughter's hair. But he knew that when power began shifting around him and no one explained why, waiting for the explanation was the surest way not to live long enough to hear it. And 30 years of survival told him to act before understanding, because understanding was the privilege of the winner, and he had no intention of becoming the other one. 2 weeks after the night, Gordon saw the line, S. Thornton, consultant, cleared by Hutton Kane, flash across the screen and vanish. He knocked on Emerson's study door at 10 o'clock at night, waited for the "come in" he had heard thousands of times in 12 years, stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and placed a thin file on Emerson's desk. A file he had spent 14 days building from scattered fragments of information buried inside systems most people didn't even know existed. Gordon didn't sit. He stood on the other side of the desk, opened the file, and placed a photograph on top, a black and white image printed from the Kane family's internal security camera 9 years earlier, and in the photograph was a 19-year-old girl sitting in front of 3 computer monitors inside a room Emerson recognized at once, because it was the private room in the mansion basement his father had used for projects he didn't want anyone to know about. The girl in the photograph was thin, her hair shorter than it was now, wearing a black t-shirt, and she was smiling. A young, confident smile, the kind of smile a 19-year-old wears before she knows what the world is going to do to her. And Emerson looked at that smile, then looked up at Gordon, and he didn't need to ask, because he had seen that face every afternoon for the past 2 weeks, thinner, more tired, no longer smiling that way, but the same person. Gordon said the full name. Sable Thornton, born in 1998. Boston. No father listed on her birth certificate. Mother died when she was 14. Raised herself from then on. Self-taught in cryptography and cybersecurity. Left MIT after 1 semester. Hired by Hutton Kane at 19 through an intermediary in the underground technology world to build the encryption system protecting the family's entire financial and operational secrets. Gordon said she was the cryptographic genius he had been searching for 7 years. The only person who could decrypt the hard drive Hutton had left behind, and she was sitting in his mansion playroom every afternoon, braiding his daughter's hair. Emerson said nothing. He looked at the photograph, looked at that 19-year-old smile, then looked up at Gordon with an expression Gordon read as continue. Gordon turned to the next page in the file. A copy of a Boston police report. A case number he had needed 3 different contacts to obtain, filed 7 years earlier. The fire in a second-floor apartment on Dorchester Avenue. 1 victim escaping before firefighters arrived. The official conclusion listed as an electrical accident, but Gordon had spoken to a retired firefighter who had been at the scene that night, and the man said that fire wasn't an electrical fire. The flames had started from 2 points at the same time, on opposite sides of the apartment, a sign of deliberately placed accelerant. And he had written that in the initial report, but the final conclusion had become an accident. The kind of conclusion that, in Boston, usually meant someone powerful enough had decided the matter didn't need further investigation. Gordon said Sable survived because Goliath, 4 months old at the time, woke her early enough for her to climb through the window, and after that night, she disappeared from every system, erased her identity, erased her trail, became no one, and had maintained that status for 7 years until his daughter found her at the Everett scrapyard. Gordon stopped, looked at Emerson, and delivered the last part more carefully, because he knew this part would change everything. The order to burn the apartment hadn't come from outside, not from the Voss family, not from any rival organization he had checked. The order had come from inside the Kane family. He hadn't confirmed exactly who yet because the chain of command had been erased very thoroughly, but it came from inside. Emerson was silent. Not the short, sharp silence he had when giving an order. Not the medium silence he had when processing. This was a long silence, the kind Gordon had learned how to measure after 12 years of working beside him. A short silence meant Emerson was calculating the next move. A medium silence meant he was weighing 2 options. A long silence meant danger, meant something inside him had shifted into a state no one wanted to be on the receiving end of. This silence was long, and inside that silence, inside the closed study with the photograph of the 19-year-old girl lying on the desk, Emerson thought of Uncle Perry. He had been thinking of Uncle Perry since Gordon first said the order came from inside, but he hadn't allowed the thought to take clear shape, because allowing it to take shape meant accepting that the man he had, called Uncle for 36 years, the man who brought candy for Blythe every Saturday, the man who sat at his right hand in every family meeting, the man his father had trusted with half the empire, might be the one who had ordered the apartment of a 19-year-old girl burned because she knew too much. Emerson looked at the photograph again, looked at the 19-year-old smile that 7 years of living like a ghost had erased from her face. Then he looked up at Gordon and said, his voice lower than usual, the voice Gordon recognized as the one Emerson used when he had already decided, and that decision would not change. Find me everything on Perry, in the 3 years before my father died. Every meeting, every transaction, every communication. I want to know what my uncle was doing when my father was still alive, and no one was watching. Emerson called Sable into his study on Friday afternoon, after Blythe went upstairs with Ruth, and when Sable stepped inside, she saw at once that this room was different from every other space in the mansion she had been allowed to enter. This was Emerson Kane's true territory, a dark oak desk, curtains drawn shut, light coming only from a single desk lamp, and the air in the room heavy in a way she recognized immediately because she had once sat in Hutton's private room, and that air had been heavy in the same way, the air of a place where decisions that changed other people's lives were made within 4 walls. Emerson sat behind the desk, and he didn't invite her to sit, not because he was being rude, but because he forgot, or because in his mind this conversation had begun before she walked in, and he was already in the middle of it, not at the beginning. He placed the photograph on the desk, its face turned toward Sable, and said nothing. Sable looked down. She saw the 19-year-old girl sitting before 3 monitors in the basement room she had thought she would never see again, and that girl was smiling, really smiling, with the kind of smile that 7 years of scrap and smoke and running had taken from her without her realizing it was gone until this moment, when she saw it on the face of an older version of herself. Sable was silent. Not the kind of silence she used to avoid Emerson's questions every afternoon, the tactical, controlled kind of silence, but the silence of someone who had just been struck in the very place that 7 years of building walls had tried to protect. And the wall didn't collapse, but it shook, and Sable felt it shaking inside her. Emerson asked, his voice low, not threatening, but not warm either. "When did you know who I was?" Sable looked up from the photograph, looked straight into his eyes, and said, "When I walked through the gate of this mansion and saw the name Kane carved into the iron bar." Emerson asked, "Why didn't you run?" And Sable answered with 3 sentences she hadn't known she had ready until they left her mouth. "Because I've been running for 7 years. And because the little girl needs me. And because I'm too tired to run from the first child in the world who looked at me as if I had worth." The tears came without her permission, without warning, without planning. They were simply there on her face, and she didn't lift her hand to wipe them away because wiping them meant admitting they existed, and admitting they existed meant allowing more to come out. So she left them there, and kept speaking. She told Emerson about the night of the fire, not the long version, but the version she had compressed for 7 years into short, precise sentences. The apartment, 3 o'clock in the morning, fire from 2 sides at once, Goliath biting her sleeve, the window, the porch roof, then standing in the street and watching everything she owned burn, and understanding that someone inside the family with the name carved on this gate wanted her to stop existing. She told him about the 7 years that followed, about erasing her name, erasing her trail, erasing everything that proved Sable Thornton was a real person, about picking scrap because it was the only work that didn't need papers, didn't need a name, didn't need a past, about the nights in the wooden house with Goliath as the only living thing in the world that knew who she was. And she said it all in a voice that wasn't asking for pity because she didn't need pity. She needed someone to listen. And the difference between those 2 things was something Emerson recognized immediately, because he, too, was someone who never asked for pity and would despise anyone who gave it to him without being asked. Emerson listened. He listened to all of it, and as he listened, he felt something he hadn't felt since Colette died, not love, because love was something he wasn't ready for, and perhaps would never be ready for in the way he had been ready for Colette, but respect, the kind of respect he reserved only for people who had been pressed down into the mud, without becoming mud themselves. And the woman standing before him had been pressed into the mud by his family's empire for 7 years, and she still kept clean curtains and a plant on the windowsill, and taught his daughter about the stars. Then Sable asked, softly, as if she too was making a trade, because this question opened into territory they both knew was dangerous. "Why does Blythe think her mother left?" Emerson looked at her, and in that moment he decided to do something he had never done with anyone except Gordon. He told the truth. He said Colette had died on the operating table, giving birth to Blythe. He said he had chosen to lie to his daughter and tell her that her mother had left because he couldn't bear the thought of Blythe growing up believing she was the reason her mother died. He said he knew the lie was wrong, but he also knew the truth would be worse. And when he finished speaking, He realized this was the first time he had said those words aloud for someone other than Gordon to hear, and relief didn't come because relief wasn't something this story could create, but something shifted, something small, like a stone being loosened from the wall he had built around himself. Sable listened, and when he was done, she was silent for a while before she said, very softly, so softly Emerson had to lean forward to hear clearly, "She doesn't hate a ghost. She hates the emptiness. Hate at least gives a child something to aim her feelings at. Emptiness gives nothing at all. It only eats." Emerson looked at her, and he realized for the second time in his life, the first being when Colette told him she wouldn't give up the baby, that a woman was telling him a truth he didn't want to hear in a voice gentle enough, that he didn't build a wall against it. He was silent for a while, and then he said, not because he had planned to say it, but because this moment was the right one, and he recognized it. "My father's cipher. Can you break it?" Sable looked at him, and she understood that this question wasn't only a technical question, but Emerson Kane giving her something he gave no one, trust, even if only in part, even if under conditions, and she answered, "Yes, I can break it. The question is whether you're ready for what's inside." Emerson took Sable down to the basement security room that night, the room whose door code no one knew except him and Gordon, and he placed the hard drive on the table, the hard drive his father had left behind 8 years earlier, and that had been lying in Hutton's personal safe ever since, like a question no one could answer, and he told Sable this was the thing she had built 9 years ago, and he needed her to open it. Sable sat down in front of the computer and plugged in the hard drive, and in the moment she placed her fingers on the keyboard, the transformation happened. Not slowly, but instantly, like a switch being turned on, and the woman who picked scrap with soot-blackened hands disappeared from that chair, and in her place was someone else entirely, someone 7 years of scrap and running had buried deep, but had not managed to kill. Her fingers moved across the keyboard fast, precise, without hesitation, without any pause to think, because she didn't need to think. This system was her child. She had birthed it from nothing 9 years earlier, and she knew every corner of it by a memory that 7 unused years had not blurred, and Emerson stood behind her watching those hands on the keyboard, and he understood, with a clarity that cut into his chest, that she had hidden this part of herself for 7 years. The genius part. The part Hutton had seen when she was 19. The part someone had tried to burn, along with the apartment in Dorchester. She had buried it beneath soot-blackened hands and piles of copper wire and a nameless life, because letting that part live meant letting Sable Thornton live, and Sable Thornton being alive meant someone would come to kill her again. 6 hours. Sable worked for 6 hours without standing up, without drinking water, without talking, and Emerson sat in the chair behind her and did not leave the room because he had decided that if something inside this hard drive was important enough for his father to build an encryption system to protect it, then he would be the first one to see it. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Sable said it was done, and she turned the screen toward Emerson, and what appeared on the screen was divided into 3 parts. The first part was a list of financial accounts, 17 accounts, scattered across 7 countries, with an estimated total value of more than $300 million, assets Hutton had hidden outside the family's main system, money Emerson had not known existed, and Perry had not known existed, and no one had known existed, except Hutton, and now Sable and Emerson. The second part was a transaction record. Detailed evidence, dates, amounts, names of intermediaries, showing that Perry Kane had sold information about the Kane family's operations and territories to the Voss family continuously for 3 years before Hutton died. 3 years during which Perry sat at his brother's right hand in every meeting and sold every decision, every number, every secret to the outside at prices Hutton had recorded down to the dollar. The third part was a note, not a data file, but a plain text file, and when Emerson read it, he recognized his father's writing, the way of writing he had seen for 28 years before Hutton died, the short sentence structure with not one unnecessary word that Emerson had inherited. "Son, if you're reading this, then someone has found the girl. Keep her safe. Perry won't allow her to live if he knows the cipher has been broken. I was wrong to trust my brother. Don't repeat that mistake. I love you." Emerson read that note twice. The first time, he read it with his eyes. The second time, he read it with something deeper than his eyes, something in his chest, where the words, "I love you," touched and would not leave. Two truths collided in his mind at the same time. Perry had betrayed Hutton for 3 years and had perhaps ordered his brother killed with the heart attack the Boston police had concluded too quickly. And Perry had ordered Sable's apartment burned 1 year later because she knew too much, and the system she had built was the only evidence that could expose him. And that man, the man who had done all of it, brought candy for Blythe every Saturday, and the little girl called him Uncle Perry. Emerson closed the laptop. He looked at Sable, and Sable looked back at him, and both of them knew that from this moment on, everything had changed, and there was no way back. Emerson said, in a voice that was not a request, not an offer, not a military order, but the voice of a man who had just read his dead father's words to him and understood that protecting the woman in front of him was his father's final wish. "You're staying here tonight. You're not going back to the old house." Sable looked at him, and she understood that this was not a question. Perry Kane didn't find Sable by her face, because her face had changed enough over 7 years not to match the faint memory he still kept of the 19-year-old girl sitting in his brother's basement. But Perry didn't need a face, because Perry found people by their habits, and habits didn't change. He had someone inside the mansion security team, not Gordon, but a lower-level employee he had bought long ago, with a small monthly payment just to keep a pair of eyes inside his nephew's house, and that person had sent him hallway camera footage showing a strange woman walking through each afternoon. The woman he had heard was Blythe's new caretaker. Perry watched the video the first time and recognized nothing. He watched it a second time and still didn't. But the third time, when he rewound the part where Sable sat beside Blythe in the playroom and typed something on the little girl's iPad, he saw the rhythm of her typing, and everything froze. That rhythm. He had seen it 9 years earlier on the basement camera feed, when he was watching the girl his brother had hired, fast, even. The little finger and index finger leading instead of the middle finger the way most people typed. A distinctive style no one could teach because it came from the way someone had taught herself. And Perry had remembered that rhythm 7 years before he ordered it burned, because he was the kind of man who remembered details other people overlooked. That was how he had survived 30 years in his brother's shadow. He rewound it again, looked more closely, and he knew the girl hadn't died in the fire. The girl was sitting inside his nephew's house, braiding the child's hair, and if she was here, that meant there was a chance Emerson knew who she was. And if Emerson knew who she was, that meant the hard drive was about to be opened, or had already been opened. And if the hard drive was opened, everything Perry had built over 30 years would collapse in 30 minutes. Perry made a call at 11 o'clock at night, to a phone number he didn't save in his contacts but remembered in his head, and on the other end was the man in the Voss family he had contacted 7 years earlier when he needed the Dorchester apartment handled, and he said briefly that he needed 2 men tonight, that there was an address in Everett, that the target was the woman living in the wooden house near the scrapyard, and that this time they needed to be certain, not like 7 years before. The 2 men arrived at the wooden house at 2 o'clock in the morning. They didn't find Sable because Sable was at the Kane mansion. In the old reading room Emerson had ordered cleared into a temporary bedroom for her only a few hours earlier, but they found Goliath. The dog heard strange footsteps on the porch before the door was forced open, and he didn't run, didn't hide. He rose in the middle of the house and faced the open door with 132 pounds of muscle and teeth and the territorial instinct the Neapolitan Mastiff breed had carried in its blood for hundreds of years. Goliath blocked their way long enough for one of the 2 men to decide that fighting this dog wasn't worth it, and that the target clearly wasn't home, and they withdrew, but not before a blade caught Goliath's right ear as they escaped his teeth. Gordon arrived at the wooden house at 6 o'clock in the morning during the routine check he had set for himself ever since Sable moved into the mansion, and he found the door broken open, the furniture disturbed, and blood streaked across the floor. He found Goliath lying in the corner of the kitchen, his right ear torn, blood clotted on the floor around his head. But the dog was still alive, still awake, still looking at Gordon with the eyes of something that had finished its duty and was waiting for someone to come handle the rest. Gordon called Emerson. Emerson ordered him to bring Goliath to the mansion immediately, call the veterinarian the family used for working dogs, and said nothing more over the phone because what needed to be said wasn't the kind of thing spoken over a phone line. Blythe saw Goliath when Gordon carried the dog in through the mansion's back door. He was lying on the blanket Gordon had spread in the trunk, his ear temporarily bandaged with Gordon's jacket, and Blythe ran to him and dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Goliath's head and crying loudly, crying without control, crying because the dog as big as a calf, the dog she had loved from her very first day at the scrapyard, was hurt, and she didn't understand why. And no one explained it to her because no one could explain in front of a 5-year-old child that someone had come to kill the woman she called Mommy. Sable heard the crying and ran out, and she saw Goliath, and she knelt beside Blythe and held both the little girl and the dog in arms that 7 years earlier had only been able to hold a 4-month-old puppy while fleeing through a second-floor window. And she looked up over Blythe's head, looked at Emerson standing by the back door, and her eyes met his, and neither of them said a word because both of them knew exactly who had given this order, and both of them knew the time had come to deal with it. Emerson called a family meeting the following night, not because he needed more time to prepare, but because he needed one day to make sure every piece of evidence had been backed up in 3 different locations known only to him and Gordon, that attorney Cynthia Price had received a copy and had legal filings ready to send within 1 hour if he gave the order, and that Blythe would be upstairs with Sable and Ruth for the entire meeting, completely away from it, not hearing, not seeing, not knowing. 8 o'clock that night, the mansion conference room, the long oak table Hutton had commissioned 30 years earlier from a woodworking shop in Vermont, 8 chairs, 8 core members of the Kane family, the people who ran different pieces of the empire, from the harbor to real estate to finance, and Perry sat in the seat to Emerson's right, the seat he had occupied for 8 years since Hutton died, the seat of an advisor, of the most trusted man, of the founder's younger brother. Gordon stood by the door, not sitting, because Gordon never sat in meetings. He stood to observe, and to be ready for whatever needed to happen. Emerson opened the meeting with silence. He looked around the table, at each face, and he stopped on Perry half a second longer than on the others, only half a second, but Perry noticed that half second because Perry read the language of power, and that half second told him this meeting wasn't about business. Emerson placed the first thing on the table, the decrypted hard drive. He set it in the center of the oak table and said this was the hard drive his father had left behind, and it had been decrypted. Perry looked at the hard drive, and his face didn't change, but his left hand tightened beneath the table, and Gordon saw it because Gordon saw everything. Emerson placed the second thing down, a printed copy of Hutton's note, every word, including the sentence, "I was wrong to trust my brother," and he pushed the paper slowly along the table toward Perry, slowly on purpose, the kind of slowness where every fraction of an inch the paper moved carried weight. The third thing, the transaction records between Perry and the Voss family, 17 pages, 3 years, every date, every sum, every intermediary's name, evidence Hutton had quietly gathered before he died and hidden in the encrypted hard drive like life insurance for the truth. The fourth thing, the report on the Dorchester apartment fire 7 years earlier, including the firefighter's assessment of accelerant and the conclusion of accident that someone powerful had forced into place. Emerson laid each thing down one by one, slowly, like setting each brick of a wall around one man, and with every brick placed, the space around Perry tightened a little more, and the other 7 members looked at the papers on the table, then at Perry, and slowly understood, one by one, that the man sitting at the boss's right hand had betrayed the family since before most of them even understood what the family was. Perry understood in the first 60 seconds. From the moment the hard drive touched the table, he understood, because he was intelligent enough to know that if the hard drive had been opened, everything was over, and he used those 60 seconds not to find a denial, but to accept that 30 years of living in the shadows had just been dragged into the light by the son of the brother he had betrayed. Emerson looked at Perry, and Perry looked back, and in that moment Emerson saw on his uncle's face, not remorse, not fear, but calculation. He was calculating whether any exit remained, and when he realized none did, his face emptied, the emptiness of a man who had pushed all his chips onto the table and lost. Emerson continued, his voice low, even, never once rising, because he had learned from his father that real power didn't need to shout. Perry would leave the family, leave Boston, leave everything bearing the Kane name, and he would never return within 500 miles of this city, and if he did, Copies of every piece of evidence on this table would be sent simultaneously to the FBI and the Voss family, and Perry knew better than anyone that the Voss family didn't forgive traitors, even when the traitor had betrayed someone for them. Emerson didn't kill Perry. Not because he didn't want to and not because he couldn't, but because on the second floor directly above this conference room, Blythe was sitting with Sable and Ruth, and Blythe called that man Uncle Perry, and Emerson wouldn't let his daughter grow up in a house where her father had killed someone in the meeting room below her bedroom, because Emerson had already hurt his daughter enough with a lie, and he had no intention of adding to that list. Perry stood. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, just as there is nothing useful to say when you have lost, and the winner has let you live, and the only thing you can do is accept that mercy and leave before it is withdrawn. Perry left the conference room, past Gordon at the door, and Gordon watched him go with the eyes of a man who had known this outcome before the meeting began and had still stood guard until it ended. The other 7 members left afterward, one by one, in silence, because they had just watched power change shape right in front of them, and no one wanted to be the one to break the silence of that moment. Emerson stood alone in the empty conference room. The oak table, 8 chairs, 7 pushed back, one still in its exact place because Perry had stood without moving his chair, a small detail Emerson noticed and remembered, because he remembered everything. Gordon stepped over to stand beside him and asked, not in the voice of a subordinate addressing a superior, but in the voice of someone who had walked beside him for 12 years, "Are you all right?" Emerson looked at Perry's empty chair and said, "My father was betrayed by his brother. I was nearly betrayed by my uncle, and this pattern stops with me." That night, after the conference room was empty, and Perry had disappeared from the mansion as if he had never existed, Emerson went up to the second floor and stood outside Blythe's bedroom door for 15 minutes before opening it. Not because he didn't want to go in, but because he was preparing for the hardest conversation of his life, harder than every negotiation with a rival family, harder than the night he gave his first order at just 28 years old and inherited the empire from his dead father, harder than all of it because the person in question was the 5-year-old child he loved more than all 37 harbor districts combined, and he was about to break the story he had built for her for 5 years. Sable stood at the end of the hallway, her back against the wall, saying nothing, and when Emerson looked at her before entering Blythe's room, she gave a small nod, only once, and that nod wasn't encouragement and it wasn't permission, but something closer. "I'm here," and that was enough. Emerson opened the door. Blythe's room had the star-shaped nightlight Ruth had bought when the little girl was 3, casting tiny points of light across the ceiling like a miniature night sky. And Blythe was lying in bed, not yet asleep, eyes open, looking up at the false stars above her, and when she heard the door, she turned and saw her father, and her eyes widened a little because he never came into her room at this hour. He looked at her sleeping from the door and left. That was how every night worked. But tonight he stepped inside and sat down on the edge of her bed. Emerson looked at his daughter, and he didn't know where to begin, because he was a man who had built his career on the ability to say exactly what needed to be said at exactly the moment it needed to be said. But nothing in those 20 years of experience had prepared him to tell the truth to the child he had lied to for her entire life. He began with Colette's name, the first time he had spoken that name in this house since the night he took her photographs down from the walls 5 years earlier. "Your mother's name was Colette." Blythe heard that name and said nothing, but she sat up in bed because she understood by instinct that something important was happening, that her father was saying something he had never said before, and she wanted to sit up to hear it. Emerson continued, one word at a time, choosing each word the way a man chooses his steps across a field he knows is full of mines. "Your mother didn't leave. Your mother loved you very much. She chose for you to be born even though she knew it was dangerous for her. Your mother was the bravest person I've ever known. She didn't leave. She stayed in you, every day, from the moment you were born." Blythe listened to every word. She didn't cry right away, not yet. She was processing, taking apart the old story she had believed for 5 years and rebuilding it with the new pieces her father had just given her, and her face in the starlight looked much older than 5, looked like the face of someone understanding something without fully understanding it, but feeling the weight of it. Then Blythe asked, and the question she chose wasn't the one Emerson had prepared for, not, "Mommy died," or, "Why did you lie?" or any of the logical questions an adult would ask. The question she chose was the only question a 5-year-old child who had spent her whole life believing her mother hadn't wanted her would ask. "So, did Mommy want me?" Emerson looked at his daughter, and the thing that had frozen inside him on that night in the hospital hallway 5 years earlier, the thing he had locked away with the same mechanism he used to survive in the underworld, that thing thawed. It didn't thaw slowly. It broke all at once, like something shattering, and he said in a voice Blythe had never heard before, a trembling voice, a broken voice, the voice of a father and not the voice of a boss. "More than anything in the world, that's why you're here," Blythe cried. She didn't cry from sadness anymore, but because something had broken open inside her, something she had carried for 5 years, the belief that her mother hadn't wanted her, and that belief broke apart. And what was underneath it wasn't emptiness, but something warm, something like the answer to every yellow-colored picture she had ever drawn. Emerson held his daughter. For the first time he held her tightly, not the kind of hug that patted her back and let go, but the kind that stayed, the kind where his arms wrapped around her and held and didn't release, and Blythe buried her face in his chest, and he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. Then Emerson cried. Not loudly, not the way people cried in movies, but silently, tears running down his face with no sound beside them, and Blythe felt it because she looked up at him and saw tears on the face of the man she had never seen cry, and she wasn't afraid. She lifted her small hand to touch his cheek and said softly, "Don't cry, Daddy. I'm here." And that sentence broke Emerson Kane completely and utterly in a way no enemy in 20 years had ever been able to do. Blythe fell asleep in his arms 20 minutes later, sleeping with the peace of a child who had just been given back something she had lost before she even knew she had it. And Emerson held her sleeping in his arms and didn't move, even though his arm went numb, because he would never again be the one to let go first. He looked up and saw Sable standing in the doorway. How long she had been there, he didn't know, perhaps from the beginning, and tears were falling silently down her face, the kind of tears that didn't ask permission, the same kind she had cried in the study when telling him about the night of the fire. But this time, she wasn't crying for her own pain. She was crying because she had just heard the most ruthless man in Boston break himself apart in front of his 5-year-old daughter, and she understood that what she had just witnessed was something 7 years of living like a ghost had made her forget human beings were capable of doing, breaking themselves open in order to rebuild the right way. The two of them looked at each other through the darkness of a child's bedroom, with stars on the ceiling. No one said anything. There was no need. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Emerson laid Blythe down gently in bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stood watching his daughter sleep for a long while before leaving the room. And when he stepped into the hallway, he didn't turn right toward his own bedroom, but turned left, toward the end of the hall, toward the room he had locked 5 years earlier and had not opened once since. He stood in front of Colette's door and looked at the lock, and he thought about tonight, about the way Blythe had asked if Mommy had wanted her, and the way that question had broken the thing he had built around himself for 5 years, and he understood that if he could break the lie for his daughter, then he also needed to break the lock for himself. He took the key from his pants pocket, the key he had kept in his desk drawer for 5 years and had taken out tonight before going upstairs to see Blythe, as though he had known this would be the night he opened both doors, the door for his daughter and the door for himself. The key entered the lock and turned, a small metallic sound in the silent hallway, and the door opened. The room was exactly as he had left it. 5 years of dust covered every surface because he had forbidden the cleaners to enter. The bed was still made with the white sheets Colette had last spread before going to the hospital. The closet was still closed. The vanity still held the bottle of perfume whose cap sat slightly crooked, because he remembered that Colette always left the cap slightly crooked, because she was always in a hurry in the mornings. And on the bedside table was the framed photograph he had not seen since the night he took the 14 pictures down from the walls, though he had not removed this one, because he had not stayed in the room long enough to see it. Emerson sat down on the bed, the white sheets making a soft rustling sound beneath his weight, and he picked up the frame. Colette was smiling in the photograph, black hair, bright eyes, smiling in the way he had loved from the first time at the free clinic on Congress Street, the kind of smile with nothing behind it but pure joy. And he looked at that smile, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel the frozen thing in his chest when he looked at her. But something else. Something close to longing but no longer cutting, close to pain but no longer suffocating. Sable heard the door open from the reading room where she was lying at the end of the hall. 7 years of hiding had taught her to sleep lightly enough that the sound of a lock turning 20 steps away was enough to pull her out of sleep, and she lay still, listening for a while before getting up, because she recognized that it wasn't the sound of danger, but the sound of someone doing something private, and she struggled between the instinct to keep her distance and another instinct, a newer instinct. The instinct Blythe had awakened in her over the past few weeks. The instinct to stay close when someone needed a presence, even if they didn't ask for it. She walked into the hallway barefoot on the wooden floor, and she saw the weak light coming from the room at the end of the hall, the room Ruth had told her was Emerson's late wife's old room, and that no one was allowed to enter. And Sable stood at the doorway of that room and looked in and saw Emerson sitting on the bed, holding the photograph. His back curved slightly forward, and she knew she was seeing something no one in the Kane family had ever seen. Emerson Kane without armor, without walls, with nothing but a man sitting on his dead wife's bed, holding her picture after 5 years of not daring to look. Emerson knew Sable was there. He didn't turn around, but he knew, because he heard the light footsteps on the wooden floor, and because he had begun to grow used to her presence in a way that let him recognize when she was near, without needing to look, and he said, his eyes still on the photograph, "She was like you. Not in how she looked, but in the way you're here without demanding anything. Colette was like that too. She stayed beside me without ever demanding that I become someone else." Sable stood in the doorway and listened, and she understood that he wasn't comparing her to Colette in the way men compared women to one another. He was trying to understand why her presence brought something that he had thought had died with Colette, and she answered with the honesty she owed both him and herself. "I'm not Colette." Emerson was silent for a while, then said, still not turning back, his voice low but clear inside the room, covered in 5 years of dust. "I know. That's why I opened this room. I need to separate, keeping her from keeping the pain. I've kept both for too long, and I don't know when missing her turned into punishing myself, but I think it changed a long time ago, and I need to stop." Sable stepped into the room. She crossed the threshold no one had crossed in 5 years, barefoot on the dust-covered wooden floor, and she sat down beside Emerson on Colette's old bed, not touching him, not taking his hand, not resting her head on his shoulder, not doing anything any other story might demand in this moment. She only sat beside him and remained present, with the kind of silence that 7 years of living alone had taught her was sometimes the only thing another person truly needed. Not advice, not comfort, not a promise that everything would be all right. Only someone sitting beside them in the dark and not leaving. And that presence, inside the room covered in 5 years of dust, with Colette's framed photograph lying between them and Blythe's star-shaped nightlight casting a small glow from the room across the hall, that presence was enough. 6 months later, the Beacon Hill mansion looked the same from the outside, but different from the inside in ways outsiders wouldn't recognize. Yet anyone who had lived in this house would feel the moment they stepped through the door. Colette's photographs had been placed back throughout the house, not 14 of them as before, but 7. Enough for her to be present without overwhelming the space, set in places Blythe passed every day so the little girl could see her mother's face whenever she wanted. And Blythe knew about Colette now, the version suitable for a 6-year-old. "Mommy loved you very much. Mommy was very brave. Mommy is in heaven and watches over you every day." Colette's room was no longer locked. The door stayed open. Ruth dusted it every week, and sometimes Blythe went in and sat on the bed and looked at her mother's photograph on the bedside table and talked to it in the small voice she thought no one heard. But Sable, passing through the hallway, always heard and always didn't stop, because she understood that moment belonged to Blythe and Colette. Blythe's room had 2 pictures hanging side by side on the wall above her bed. One was a photograph of Colette, the one Emerson had taken from the basement filing cabinet, and framed again. Colette smiling, black hair, bright eyes. The second was a drawing Blythe had made herself. 3 stick figures and 1 big black circle. Sable with a ponytail, Blythe with 2 braids, Goliath with 4 legs much shorter than they really were, and behind them a small rectangle Blythe said was the wooden house at the scrapyard, where everything began. Sable no longer picked scrap. She managed cybersecurity for Emerson's legitimate division, real estate and harbor development, work she did better than anyone Emerson had ever hired, because she was the one who had built the security system for the entire empire when she was 19, and now she was rebuilding it on the cleaner side. She lived in the mansion, in the old reading room that was now her room, and Goliath lay outside her door every night, but during the day he lay at the foot of the stairs, in the middle of the foyer, a position he had chosen for himself as if he understood that his duty now wasn't only to protect Sable, but to protect the whole house. And his right ear bore a scar where the fur never grew back, the only mark left from the night Perry made his move. Sable still wore her old white shirt on weekends, the shirt now even more yellowed with age, but she didn't replace it because it was her. The way the wooden house was her, the way the hands that had once been blackened with copper and aluminum were her, and that simplicity amid marble and chandeliers wasn't awkwardness, but choice. And Emerson had learned to understand that it was the most beautiful thing about her. Blythe was 6 now, calling Sable Mommy Sable as naturally as breathing, not because anyone told her to, but because she had decided it from the first $100 bill, and nothing in the world could change the decision of a child carrying Cain blood once she had made up her mind. Sunday morning, the kitchen table, the 12-seat table where now 3 people sat instead of 2. Blythe was drawing, crayons scattered across the tabletop. Sable sitting across from her and drinking black coffee without sugar from a ceramic mug Ruth had bought for her, because Ruth had decided that anyone who made Blythe laugh like that deserved her own mug in the kitchen cabinet. Emerson passed the kitchen on his way to the study, and he stopped in the doorway not because there was anything important, but because the scene in front of him made him stop. Blythe drawing and Sable drinking coffee and no one saying anything, and that silence wasn't the cold silence he had lived with for 5 years. It was warm, it had shape, it smelled like coffee and wax crayons and Sunday morning. Blythe looked up and saw her father in the doorway, and she said, in the most ordinary voice in the world, the voice only a child who had found her place could have, "Daddy, I don't need to buy Mommy Sable anymore today, right? Because Mommy is free now." Sable laughed. That smile. The smile Blythe had seen for the first time at the Everett scrapyard, when the little girl stood by the fence watching the woman with soot-blackened hands sorting copper wire, the gentle smile that didn't fit the circumstances but fit the person perfectly. That smile was here now, in the kitchen of the Beacon Hill mansion, and it was still exactly the same, because Sable had changed everything in her 28 years of life. But no one, and nothing, could change that smile, Emerson said, and his voice carried something that hadn't existed 6 months earlier, something close to relief. "That's right. Mommy is free now." Blythe thought for 1 second, then said, "Then I'll save $100 to buy ice cream." Gordon stood in the kitchen doorway behind Emerson, holding a mug of coffee, and he looked at the scene before him. The boss, standing at the kitchen door looking at his daughter and the woman he had found because of a $100 bill, and Gordon thought this was the first time in 5 years he had seen Emerson Cain look more like a human being than a family. Sable Thornton had lived 7 years like a ghost because the Cain family had almost killed her. She had returned to the Kaine family because a 5-year-old child held a $100 bill and asked if she could be a mother. The world that had tried to destroy her had become the very world where she found a family, and that irony wasn't fate's joke, but proof that life sometimes pays back those who have endured long enough with the very thing they deserve to receive. The difference between surviving and living is sometimes only a child, a black dog with a scarred ear, a crumpled $100 bill, and a man brave enough to reopen the room he had locked for 5 years. This story is not only a story about the Mafia or power or family secrets. It is a story about how love sometimes comes from the place you least expect, how the loneliest child can be the one who connects the most broken hearts, how the person wounded most deeply is not the weakest, but often the strongest, because they have survived long enough to know what it truly means to live. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself somewhere in Blythe or Sable or Emerson, tell us how you feel. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in a way you never expected? Have you ever been the scrap picker, or the child holding a $100 bill, or the man who kept a room locked for 5 years? Share your story in the comments, because we read every comment, and each of your stories is the inspiration that keeps us creating videos that touch the heart every day. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, press the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the next stories. Please like this video and share it with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.